Now, if you're anything like me, you may be a bit confused these days about what it means to be on the left, which is why I entitled this speech, What's Left? When Justin Trudeau and his puff of smoke platform is accused by conservatives as being a, quote, left-wing dreamer, when Al Gore, Bill Gates, Hillary Clinton, and Michael Bloomberg are regularly charged by Fox News as being radical leftists, when Sesame Street, and I watched it when I was young, so that may explain everything, but when Sesame Street is attacked by a US pundit for spreading the radical agenda of the left, and the movie Happy Penguins 2 is accused by another pundit of, quote, trying to indoctrinate our children with left-wing propaganda. When the Globe and Mail claims that Hollywood has been taken over by the left and cites as its leading example the movie Avatar, it's true. And Wikipedia notes that NBC, CBS, ABC, and CNN are, quote, frequently accused by many of biasing their coverage toward left-wing views. When all of this is going on, when left-wing is thrown around so frequently and casually to describe things that don't really seem left at all, it kind of makes you wonder, does the idea of left-wing have any meaning anymore? And that confusion only deepens when people who you think are on the left, who you think are your fellow travelers, insist that they're not. Like Callie Lassen, who I admire a great deal, the publisher of Adbusters, a man celebrated by many as having started the entire Occupy movement, but who recently told the Globe and Mail, that old left-right thing, man, I hate it. We have to jump over the dead body of the left. I have a feeling that this new political wavelength that young people are on will be some sort of strange hybrid of the left and the right. Strange indeed. Now, in light of these comments, and also the fact that, as Lassen implies, the idea of left may not have the same resonance among youth that it once did, in light of all of this, it may seem old-fashioned, it may seem fuddy-duddy, it may even seem conservative and reactionary to defend the idea of left-wing, but that's what I'm going to do. I want to argue that there's a lot of value left in the idea of left, and in fact that that idea may be more important today than it's been for some time. So let me start by talking about what I think we're talking about when we're talking about being left. There are, I think, three propositions. Unfortunately, there isn't a question period, so nobody can challenge me on this definition, but if you have three leftists in the room, you have four opinions about what it means to be on the left and all of that. But number one, we on the left believe that people's fates and fortunes, who we are as individuals, what we believe, what we're able to become and accomplish in our lives, that these things are profoundly shaped for good and for ill by our communal attachments, by our social conditions, and by our social relations. So contrary to Margaret Thatcher, we believe there is such a thing as a society, and it very much determines who we are as individuals and what we can do. Number two, we on the left believe that in our collective existence as societies, we're obliged to foster conditions through laws and policies and programs that enable everyone, as equally as possible, to flourish, to realize their potentials as human beings, to live free of want and need and exploitation and suffering in clean, sustainable, healthy environments in societies that are socially just and equal. Number three, we believe that the institutions we create and authorize to deliver these important, crucial social goods are civil institutions of government, of education, health, science, culture, justice, that these institutions must be, to borrow a phrase, of the people, for the people, by the people, that they must be public institutions, democratic institutions, institutions that are accountable to the people. Of course, people in this room are going to clap at that. We all agree with those things, and they seem fairly obvious. But I think it's important to put them on the table. I think it's important to re-examine them and to recommit to them. And I think it's particularly important today because we are going through a very strange political time. One in which there's a kind of uncoupling or a detaching of progressivism from the core ideas and beliefs of the left that I've just described. It's a kind of, for lack of a better description, it's a kind of privatization of progressivism that's currently underway. A new and growing sense that the good society, the new Jerusalem, the path to sustainability and social justice will be brought to us not by public institutions and democratic governments, but by Coca-Cola, by Nike, by Microsoft. Indeed, the CEOs of those very companies, along with 11 others, recently joined forces at the Davos World Economic Forum to declare that the world's major corporations were now poised, indeed obliged, to assume the mantle of leadership on the world's most pressing problems. We are at a, quote, new frontier in corporate global citizenship and a new era in public-private partnership, the CEOs declared. And it was now the duty of major corporations, they said, to take the lead in, and here I'm quoting, God help us, building better governance systems and public institutions, close quote. Big business is the solution, not the problem. That's the essential message of these CEOs. Corporations should be seen as partners, indeed lead partners, not as foes, not as obstacles, in making the world a better place, in solving its most pressing problems. And that message has become, especially over the last decade, a mantra for big business, not to mention a constant presence in marketing campaigns, on our TV screens, and corporate social responsibility initiatives, annual reports, and earnest gatherings of NGOs, academics, business groups, government officials, and perhaps most disturbingly, of progressive youth. At a recent We Day rally in Vancouver, where 18,000 young progressives came to celebrate, and I'm quoting, to quote, celebrate the power of young people to create positive change in the world, as the event's website proclaimed, the presence of major corporations was overwhelming and ubiquitous. Companies were handing out free stuff. They were filling arena screens with ads for their products, Coke, Disney, Molson Beer at a youth gathering, but anyways. They were, the host of the whole thing, Ben Mulroney, introduced a slick TELUS video to wild cheers from the crowd. Now let's watch this video, he said, about how TELUS believes in the power of young people to change the world. The ideological message, effectively the same one stated by the CEOs at Davos and pumped out in endless corporate marketing and public relations campaigns. The ideological message, again, is that corporations, far from contributing to the world's problems, should be looked to as leaders in finding solutions, in creating good, just, and sustainable societies. And that ideological message, I want to suggest, and I don't think I have to convince anybody here, that ideological message is having disastrous political effects because what it envisions is a society in which corporations, not public institutions, not democratic governments, but corporations, collectivities of private capital, institutionally programmed to elevate the private interests of their owners above all others, and unaccountable to anybody but their owners. The ideological message is that these powerful institutions of private interest should now be entrusted to deliver the public good, to protect and promote the public interest. And the inevitable political effect of that message is to put a happy and seemingly progressive face upon continuing privatization and continuing deregulation, upon the all too real prospect of corporations governing society rather than being governed by it. Let me give you an example, a very real one. Over the past 30 years in the US, Public schools, especially those in inner city and poor districts, have been starved adequate funding. They've deteriorated as a result. Everybody agrees the system is in crisis and has been for some time. But if you listen to school reform advocates in the US, including many allegedly progressive ones, the reasons behind the crisis are not chronic underfunding and neglect, but rather unaccountable and greedy teachers and unions, along with the presumed inherent inefficiency of public institutions and governments. And if you listen a bit further, the solution proposed is to make schools run more like businesses and to ensure that more schools are run by businesses. In the spring of 2008, a symposium was held at Chicago's exclusive Mid-America Club to celebrate the first 3 years of a school reform program in the city called Renaissance 2010. The name of the symposium, Free to Choose, Free to Succeed, the New Market of Public Education, captured its animating idea that public schooling should be governed by private sector values and goals. Arne Duncan, then the head of the Chicago school system, and he had recently changed his title from school superintendent to CEO. Arne Duncan was the symposium star attraction. We're trying to blur the lines between the public and the private, he told the audience. I am not a manager of 600 schools, he said. I'm a portfolio manager of 600 schools, and I'm trying to improve the portfolio. Now, while Duncan had overseen Renaissance 2010, he had delegated the detailed drafting of the plan to the Commercial Club of Chicago, the voice of the city's business elite. And that organization had openly declared that its intention was nothing short of reshaping Chicago's school system to reflect a, quote, private sector perspective. 60 schools were closed, 100 new schools were opened in their place. The new schools were all run by private organizations, including for-profit companies. And unlike the schools that they replaced, not one of them had a union. The overarching effect of Renaissance 2010 was to transform a quintessentially public institution, public schooling, into a market-driven partnership with business. Now, unfortunately, that approach has become the model for a new reform movement that is sweeping the entire United States, and that's touted by many, including many progressive reformers, as the way forward. Indeed, President Obama's national education policy, Race to the Top, is modeled on most of the key elements from Chicago's Renaissance 2010, which should really come as no surprise, given that the person President Obama chose as his Secretary of Education when he was first elected, and who continues in that role today, is none other than the architect of Chicago's school privatization plan, Arne Duncan. Now, what's going on in US schools is a classic privatization story. Tax cuts lead to revenue crunches lead to underfunding, underfunding causes dysfunctions, crowded classrooms, broken down buildings and furniture, burned out teachers, too few staff, dysfunctions that make it difficult, if not impossible, for teachers to teach and students to learn. And inevitably, schools fail. But it's not inadequate funding that's blamed, it's teachers and their unions. And it's not funding, the vitriol against teachers in the United States is astounding in mainstream media and in the school reform movement. And it's not better funding that's proposed as a solution, it's privatization. More industry and corporate involvement, more market-driven incentives and sanctions. And not surprisingly, the main backers and proponents of all of this come from the ranks of big business. Indeed, none other than that left-wing radical Bill Gates is at the head of this new school reform movement, along with Mayor Bloomberg from New York, another left-wing radical, according to Fox News, and also the Waltons family, which nobody actually accuses of being left-wing radicals, the owners of Walmart.